Hey guys, my name is Addison Webb. I'm an iOS developer, live down in Franklin, currently in between jobs at the moment. So tonight I'm going to be talking about iOS testing, unit testing, UI testing a little bit, integration testing a little bit. I first wanted to start off by saying I'm not an expert on testing. I just got kind of started into testing about 6 months ago. I was working on one of my side projects, and it was a few years old. It was all in Objective-C. A lot of the code had kind of become a tangled mess. It was a pain to work with, and there were actually several really big bugs that were kind of deep down into some of the plumbing of the application. So I started trying to debug some of those bugs, trying to fix them. As I was in that code, I got to thinking there's got to be a way I can know that my code works. Like, this doesn't make any sense why all this code is just randomly strung together and I have no way of knowing how that whether it works or not. So I kind of got into testing because of that. I started slowly writing unit tests to test out code that I was refactoring. And so I think that kind of gets us into why is testing important. Well, we all want to write high quality applications. We want to write apps that are bug free, and we want code that is easy to update in the future and also maintain. So some of the benefits of testing are that it'll help you find regressions as you are making changes to your code. You would run unit tests after you make a change, and as long as those unit tests pass, you at least know that the code that you wrote didn't break anything that you had previously written. It also helps document your code. So what's great about Objective-C and Swift is your code is kind of self-documenting. You have like nice long method names. You can be verbose and explain what is happening. But unit tests are kind of another way to document your code. So if someone comes to a piece of code that you've written and they might wonder how that code is supposed to be used, or wonder kind of what the boundaries are of that code, they can go just look at any unit tests that you wrote for that code and kind of get a better understanding of how that code was intended to be written. It also makes you a better developer, and I think that's one point that I want everyone here, if you don't get any of the technical stuff that I'm talking about tonight, I would like everyone to get this one point, and I think it makes you a better developer. I think that when you write tests, it forces you to write your code in a certain way that that makes your code better. It helps you move code out and separate it. It helps you isolate code in a way that is much easier to read and also test. And now, again, kind of going back to the first point, it gives you confidence when you are making changes in your code, because you can make a change knowing that if it breaks something that you've written before, that you have written the test for, that test will fail, and you'll know before it's too late, before you deploy your code. So what are tests? Tests are essentially code that you write to verify that your production code works in the way you expect. There are 3 different categories of tests. There are categories, but it's kind of more of a sliding scale, but we'll get into that in a moment. So there are unit tests. Unit tests are tests that test like the smallest unit of code that you can possibly test. And typically you'll see that as a function or a method. So you'll write your method, and you'll write a series of tests to verify that that method behaves as you would expect. Integration tests are kind of the next step. And integration tests are tests that you would write that combine multiple components and validates the behavior of the interaction between those 2 components. So say you have like a function that goes and gets a value that's stored in user defaults and then does something with it. Well, that method that you just wrote that went to go get something from user defaults is interacting with another component. It's interacting with the user defaults. And so I guess you could qualify, it might be a little fuzzy, but you could qualify that as kind of an integration test where you're not only testing the behavior that the business logic that was in your method, but also the fact that it successfully went and got the value that was expected from user defaults. And then UI tests, which are kind of a form of integration tests. And that's UI tests are kind of the highest level. The thing that separates UI tests from, say, unit tests or integration tests is that you're not programmatically testing your API. You're really interacting with the application in a similar way to what a user would. And so UI tests are a bit different than any other tests you might write. So tonight we're primarily going to focus on unit tests, as unit tests typically have the most benefit, at least for people starting off testing, in my experience. So this is the testing pyramid, and this kind of gets back into that sliding scale of unit tests and UI tests. You can kind of look at this testing pyramid in the same way that you would look at the food pyramid, and that you will typically have more unit tests than you will UI tests. So you have more of the tests that fit into the category of a unit test than you would a UI test. And you have that for multiple reasons. But the main reason is that unit tests are typically easier to maintain. Since they're testing a smaller unit of code, when something goes wrong, it's a lot easier to know why it went wrong. So versus if you have like a UI test is the ultimate integration test. It could be anything. It could be your connection with the database is bad. It could be your connection with the network is bad. It could be that you wrote your table view incorrectly. It could be any of those things. So they're a lot harder to maintain and update when you make changes to your application. So some qualities of a good unit test. Good unit tests are repeatable, meaning that you can run the test multiple times with the same inputs and you'll always get the same result. They're fast. You shouldn't have to wait all day for your unit tests to run. You shouldn't be waiting on the network or anything like that. They should be able to run almost instantly. And then good unit tests are automated. So you shouldn't have to remember to run your unit tests before you deploy your application. Unit tests, ideally, are run automatically for you after you make a commit. I think of all of the three of those, I think repeatable is probably the most important of the three. It's really frustrating when you write a test and you get different results every time you run it. It's hard to understand if the test is the problem or if the code you wrote has a bug in it. So repeatable is very important. And I think we'll get to more on that in a minute. So there are a couple approaches to testing. One is to never write tests, and the other one is test-driven development, which is writing the test before you write your actual code. That's kind of a joke because it's kind of the extremes. There's certainly a middle ground in there. And that's kind of where I come, where I personally fall. I enjoy writing tests. I believe they're valuable. But I guess there are arguments for all three of those. There are arguments to be made that tests really don't help you that much. There are arguments to be made that writing tests for everything help, but somewhere in between is probably the right answer. Okay, so a little bit of more specifics. There are lots of testing frameworks out there. I'm only going to cover XCTest. XCTest tonight. XCTest is the testing framework that's built right into Xcode, and it provides mechanisms for testing code performance through and testing with unit tests and UI tests. It has mechanisms for testing asynchronous code. It has all of that built in, so it's very capable out of the box. In my personal experience, I haven't found a need to go outside and look at other frameworks for my testing needs. So this is what you would get out of the box when you set up your application and you set up a test target. And so you can see that to get started, use subclass XC test case, and then you are good to go. You can start writing test methods. Test methods follow a pattern where they start with the word test, they're prefixed with the word test, and then followed by anything. And that name should be descriptive of what that test is intended to verify. And then they return void. So you can write as many tests as you would like in a XC test case subclass. And we'll see another example here in a second. So to demonstrate writing tests tonight, I wrote a simple application called Nashville ZA, which is an application that shows you pizza locations in Nashville, and it shows you the closest ones to you first. Very simple application, just a single table view. So you can see this is the code behind the table view. This is what I just came up with initially. Didn't spend much time on it, didn't really think about testing. I would say this is probably a decent representation of some code that you all have seen before. I think we've all written code that looks like this, where testing was a complete afterthought. We'll get into a little more details here in a second. This is the model. This is the location. So it just has a name, a rating, and a latitude and longitude. And then a couple methods, convenience methods to get the distance from where you're at currently, which is just hard-coded in, and then, which is actually this location. And then a way to get the miles and all that information in the stream. And this is the table you sell, which we won't be testing anything on because it's pretty much just layout, and we're not doing a UI test on it. So let's go back to the table view controller. I think the one thing that I think is that you can start out with in looking in your code, if you're looking to get started with writing unit tests, is to look for code that can be pulled out and separated into another logical unit. Code that can live elsewhere, but is just thrown into a class just because it was convenient. So in this case, we have this sort by distance method, and it's private to this class, so there's really no easy way to test it. But I don't really see a reason why that should have to live in the table view controller, so we're going to pull that out. Testing is typically easier when methods have one job, they take a set of inputs, and they produce one output. That makes testing a lot easier. So let's do that with this method here. So we're going to pull it out, and we're going to put it into its own extension. And just like that, it's no longer private. So this should be a lot easier to test. The input is itself the array, and it has one output, just an array of locations. So that should be a lot easier to test now. And this is what the unit test looks like for that. And here you can kind of see the pattern where we set up our test data. This is our input. Once that's set up, we have our action where we sort those locations, and then we assert that that action had the desired effect that we wanted. So here we just have an array of locations, not ordered in any specific order, and then we test that they come back ordered in the way we would expect. This may not be the best example. We'll get to our code challenge later, but it is related to this. So this is the common pattern. It's commonly referred to as arrange, act, and assert. And this is, you're arranging your data, you're acting upon it, and then you're asserting that it matches what you expect. I believe that was developed, never mind. So another example. So we had the location. That also had a private method on it. So if we separate that out, this one's simply calculating the distance from meters and converting it into miles. And so now the new location, if we get rid of that and the distance string, we can put that into an extension on CL location distance, and that will be much easier to test as well. And so these tests are maybe a little more simpler than the first one even, where we set up, we're asserting several different things on each test. So when you write a test method, a unit test method, you don't have to be limited to asserting one thing and then writing a completely separate test to assert another thing. You can assert multiple different things in one test. And if any one of them fails, the entire test will fail. So here we have a few distances in meters, and we are just verifying that computed property will output the expected result, converting to miles. And then the same thing, taking that miles value and then inserting that into a string. So those are a couple examples of pulling out code that was tightly coupled to something it maybe didn't need to be, and pulling it out into a separate logical unit and making it easier to test. So now I'm going to show you a little bit of Xcode and how tests are kind of integrated into the IDE. So to run your tests, you just do Command U. You can also run them from the command line if you want. And the main spots that you'll be looking at are the test navigator and the project navigator. And so here in the top left in your panels, you'll see the little, the diamond with the horizontal line is your test navigator. That's where you'll see all of your tests displayed, and you can see their status. After you run it, you can see whether the test is passed or failed. From there, you can go to the report navigator and get more detailed information about each time you run the tests and the status of those tests and whether they passed or failed and what passed and what failed. And then you also, in the same report navigator, there's a tab for code coverage. And code coverage is just simply a measurement of the code in your app that is exercised by your unit tests. It's a metric that you can use to get an overall sense for how well you have tested your code. Some people are very religious about it, about trying to get 100% code coverage, but I tend to see it more as a metric that you can use to understand how well you're doing. So I'm going to back out here and go into that test project here. So we have the test project, and I'm going to show you first what just running the test looks like and how fast it is. On something simple like this, it is nearly instant. Just enter it in Command U, and you can see right there that the test had succeeded.
Very gratifying.
And yes, very gratifying to see that check mark come up. And if we go in here into the test navigator, we can see all the tests that I wrote with green check marks up there. So we're all good. If I were to go in to some of my code and I don't know, I was changing how the locations were sorted. And so I went in here into my extension here, and I don't know, accidentally, for some reason, I changed that operator and completely reversed the way that array was sorted. And I was to save that and then run the tests again. We'll see that one of those tests fails. And so this is what I was talking about when I was talking about confidence. I can go in and edit my code with confidence, knowing that if I change the way that a bit of my code behaves that I've tested, I will be notified. So we would get that. We would see, oh, something failed. I'll run it. and we can jump to the report and see, the sort distance test failed, and it looks like all of those assertions that we had in that test failed. So something's obviously wrong with how that data was being sorted, and I can go in and fix that. And since we were testing one method that has one input and one output, it's very easy to see that, well, this failed. There's only one thing that we're doing, so the problem must be there. And you can just go command click into that part of the code and fix it. And we run our tests again, and they pass, and we feel better. And we didn't ship a bug.
Okay.
Which, yeah, exactly. Which is a good thing.
Quick question about that workflow. So let's say you're tracking down one test that's failed, and you're trying to figure out what it is. Do you have to run all the tests again, or can you just run that one test?
No, you can just run the one test. So, say we changed it, right? And it fails. If you just click the little play button there in the test navigator, or if you go into the tests as you written them, you can click the little check mark by it. Yeah, it doesn't really look like a button, but you can click it and it'll run just that one test. Yep. Good question. But I'm going to change that back. All right. Cool. So also in your report navigator is where your continuous integration servers will show up with Xcode Server. Not everyone uses Xcode Server. Actually, I think it's pretty rare. I don't know many people who use Xcode Server to run their continuous integration. But that is where it would show up as well. It would show up down here, and each time you would make a commit, it would do the building and everything down there. So, lost somewhere. Yeah, so in conclusion, look for code that you can separate out into separate logical units to make your code more easily testable. Write code in a way that reduces side effects. So kind of the single responsibility principle where you're writing your methods to where they do one thing and one thing only. And use tests as an indicator of your quality of code. If you try to write tests as you are writing your code, I think you'll find that the overall quality of your code will be much better because your code will be separated into units that make more sense and are much more easily updated and maintained in the future. So, yeah. If we have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
This is more along the line of an entrepreneurial thing, but say you inherit a project, there's no testing in it at all. Convincing a client that this is a good thing and you need to spend money to do it.
That's a hard thing to do. I know a lot of agencies, people that write code for other people struggle with this because the value isn't immediately apparent. I mean, you can run the application, right? It works, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's a struggle. But I think if you have a client who's focused more on the future, that's a much easier sell because I think you can pitch them on the fact that the code will be much more easily maintained and it'll cost them a lot less in the future to keep that code up and running.
To add to that, I would say, if you've got a big project that was written without tests, it's probably not going to be easy to just tack those on. You're probably going to have to refactor a fair amount of the code to even be testable. If it's doing things like, talking to the network and then it has all the business logic mixed in there, like you got to pull those things apart. So it probably isn't, a great decision on code bases like that to try to go that route. Because You're just going to spend a lot of time, and in refactoring may introduce other bugs. So it's like a stability thing too. You kind of just want to leave it how it is.
When you're in that situation, could you focus on key areas? Are there any strategies, like things that are maybe not focus so much on the view controllers, but focus on more mission critical components?
I mean, you might have an answer. It sounds like you've had some experience with this.
I like to lead questions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it doesn't. You don't have to start by tackling the biggest thing first, right? Like a view controller and separating all things out and trying, moving them around and then trying to organize that all that chaos. You can start small. It can start with just all new code that you write. That you write that in a way that can be testable. Simple things like how I pulled some of those things out into extensions. Mm-hmm. If you notice there's a piece of code that might be better off in an extension or something like that, go ahead and pull that out and write a test for that. Extensions are a really good, starting point for writing unit tests. I don't know if you have any other ideas.
Yeah, so just to give you guys a real world example, I inherited some code that one of my clients had where they had their own custom JSON parsing library, right? And if you remember last month, I alluded to this and talked about how I was tasked with converting that from the deprecated custom thing to codables. How do you verify that the old models work exactly like they used to when you convert them to this new JSON parsing library? Well, so we wrote model tests. So you would take some raw string data, use the Codable protocol to decode that data into models, and then you would write your assertions. So set up using codables and then assert using Xcode or something like that. So that's a good place to start as well as your models that are usually and hopefully a little more self-contained.
Yeah. There's a great book by Michael Feathers called Working Effectively with Legacy Code. Has a lot of...
Could you put that on the meetup?
I actually have a link to it because that was something that came up a lot when I was working on this
presentation, or
it's not on the presentation. I'll make sure it ends up in the repo.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What's the title of that book again? Working Effectively with Legacy Code.
Yeah.
And fun fact,
I need to put that on my pillow.
He defines any code not covered by tests as legacy.
There you go.
I think it's a good definition.
Right.
I just like to add one thing. I think a good place to start if you're trying to add tests to your app is start with your database queries and make sure they're each wrapped up in a method. And then for each test, populate your database with some data and then run your query method and make sure it returns the right stuff. So that's usually the lowest level in your app, and then you can kind of work up from there. I found that to be a good strategy.
Would you qualify that as an integration test?
Since
you're working with the database?
You could. It's kind of it's like a repository, some people call it. So it is interacting with the disk and stuff.
Probably a low level integration test.
Yeah. And also realize in testing, don't feel like you have to test things that Apple has written. So I don't need to test to make sure that NS fetch request works correctly. So you want to make sure you're just testing your stuff and not feeling like you have to cover just basic functionality and stuff like that.
Yes. There's probably an advanced testing talk that could be given on some more of that kind of stuff.
Good stuff.
I have a question about Xcode tests.
Yeah.
I noticed that your asserts were just Booleans. Do you have options to have I expected this string and I got this string instead? Or do you only have true-false assertion?
Yes. Let me pull up the documentation here.
It's assert equals.
Yeah, I just wanted that.
Yeah, assert equals right here.
Yeah.
I think that's...
I'm trying to remember what I saw. It listed all of the assertions that you can do, but...
If you go back to Xcode and command click into it, it'll take you to the header file. And you should
maybe that was it. Well, you're not going to see much there, but...
if you go back and command click on the XC test assert,
oh, you're right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Should take you all the asserts.
There you go. Yeah.
Equals, yeah.
Yeah, and the one thing that I didn't do here is that you can provide a message at the end of any assert. So you can say, expected value, X does not equal expected value Y, and so in your test navigator, you'll see the log, and it'll show you, 1,000 is not equal to 0 or whatever it might be, and get more information there. Yeah, that was kind of me just being lazy as I was writing my unit tests. But
XC test is very comprehensive. It has a lot of stuff, everything from asynchronous testing to just basic logic stuff. I mean, it's pretty great. I think it is also open source and cross-platform now.
I think, yeah.
So if you want to write unit tests for your server-side Swift application, you can use XC test.
Third party, what are there? Anybody else trying to tackle this?
As far as testing frameworks,
Yeah.
there are several. I'm not familiar with them because I've only been using XC test. Is KIF one?
KIF is the UI testing
Right.
framework, and there's some other ones. If you've seen testing in other languages, the more like behavior driven development, and it's more kind of a fluent style where you're like, I expect this to be blank. They kind of have like a DSL for it. There's some
and Quick were the ones I
Quick, yeah.
That is really good. It's more like
Specta and
Specta.
Yeah, it's more like a spec.
Yeah. And then if you want to get really crazy, there's like property testing, which is basically property test generates random values and like sends them into your method, and it'll find like problematic cases, like divide by 0 or something you might not think to test. So that's pretty cool.
One thing I'll add about the different assertions. So like in this case, if you do use XCT assert equal, if it fails, it'll actually give you a more descriptive message about why it failed, because it'll say your expected value is this and the actual value is this. I think XCT assert will just say like true is not equal to false. Or something.
False is not true.
Yep.
And furthermore, there's some additional arguments at the end of asserts that you can put in, like lines and files. So, and the kind of macro for that is you do a pound line and a pound file will, like, I'm not sure how to explain it.
I have a good example here. I'll pull up real quick.
But it's good if you want to like create your own custom asserts that like explore a little bit deeper into custom objects that you create.
Oh no, where did I put that? We'll see if this has it in there. This was some work I was doing, mocking some of the Apple frameworks so that I could fully test some of my code with some integration tests. Yes. Okay. So I have this code here that this is some tests to test the mock for user defaults.
Can you make that just a little bit bigger?
Yeah. And this, I think, would be getting more into some of the advanced topics. But basically, what I want to do is I want to test that my mock behaves similarly to user defaults with how, if you give it an empty string or whatever, that it returns the same thing user defaults would. And so I'm just testing a bunch of strings and integers and floats and doubles. So what I did is I wrote one method that will set the value in my mock object and also set the value in user defaults, and then it'll compare the two. Asking for, give me the string for that key, give me the integer for that key, give me the float for that key. So it's a lot of repetitive code. If you were to write all of this code for every time one of these is run, that'd be a lot of code in your tests. So I kind of pulled that out. But one thing is frustrating if you do that and you don't provide these file and line macros. I think
Constants, like
whatever you call them. It's really frustrating because for every time any one of those tests fail, it tells you that one of these asserts fail, and in the main method down here that gets called 100 times. And it's not very helpful when that continues to fail over and over and over again. So by providing those file and line numbers, you actually get helpful
Drill down.
failures that tell you exactly where in the file that assertion failed.
This is
So
the most useful thing I've learned tonight. I've been struggling with this with some unit tests where I abstracted a lot of it like you did, and wow, that's awesome! I didn't know this.
Nice.
yeah, so good point.
So I just have a general story. So if you're like me, at this point, maybe you're like, or like I used to be, you may be wondering like, well, this seems like you're just writing a lot of extra code. Maybe it's not a whole lot of extra value. If you start writing unit tests, even if you don't want to, there will come a point where you write a unit test that saves your bacon, and you will realize in this golden moment epiphany how important unit tests are. And for me, that moment, when I was working at Griffin Technology, it was a consumer electronics company. I was working on an iPhone app that would talk to some external hardware. Who knows what Indianness is in computer science, right? So like, if you've got, it's basically the difference between when you have raw binary data, reading it from left to right versus from right to left. Different platforms have different Indianness. Like the Mac has a different Indianness than the iPhone. And the iPhone has a different Indianness than this external device I was talking to. So we were packing all this information into this raw binary data, and I was writing unit tests for it. And my unit test kept failing for this one specific case, and I was like, what is going on? Like, everything is right. I followed the spec. And I had written the test correctly, but I did not implement the method on my side correctly, so I was getting back this data that was was basically backwards from what I was expecting. And that's when it occurred to me, unit tests are valuable, and they will save you a lot of time and headaches in the future. So I hope everybody has that moment as they're writing tests.
Hopefully not everybody's working with a binary.
Yeah, well, absolutely. That is a very extreme example, but like I'm sure Addison has come across examples in something like his maybe Explore Michigan app or even in his everyday work. So
It was my baseball app that I really started to write tests for it because I had this setup flow where you would have to select a team and a player before you could start a game. And my logic for setting up that game was flawed. There were bugs in it all over the place. And so it really was to the point where it's like, well, if I can't trust myself to think through a problem clearly, I'm going to have to hold my own hand as I go through this and write tests to verify my code. And in the end, like I said, why I'm a big proponent of writing tests is I think that in the end, I wrote better code because of that. And so the tests are nice to have moving forward. I know that if I change something and break it, I'll know. But really moving forward, the best thing that happened from writing tests was that I refactored my code in a way that was much, much easier to update and maintain. So,
I have a question. You're kind of getting close to it.
Yeah.
At what point, let's say you're starting a project from scratch, at what point do you start considering tests?
some people would argue you should write the test before you write any code.
That's what I'm like, because like, especially in the client world, like I don't do iOS, I do other development. And my tests start when I'm getting requirements from them. Like I'm writing tests against what they're telling me versus what I think it should be. Because there can even be a miscommunication in the client's expectation versus my execution.
Right.
I feel like here it's kind of testing execution more than expectation.
Yeah. I think another thing that I've run into is I'll try to start writing tests up front and then realize like I didn't have my API exactly right. Now I have to refactor all my tests. So sometimes I like to make some progress like writing code till I feel like it's stable enough that I can attach like this whole bunch of extra code onto it to test it. Yeah. So that's another thing I like to think about.
Another thing I do, so I don't do like real TDD, but sometimes if I like write some method, I'm like, okay, I need to write a test for this. I'll go write a test stub and just put XCT fail in there and just give it a good name so I remember, oh, I need to go write this test.
Yeah.
It's a good trick.
Yeah.
Do you go back and write the test?
We just never run something.
I just leave it that way and I just let them all fail. I'm like, hey, I got tests.
This is fine.
So that leads me to another question. So if you are getting started in testing, right? So maybe you've got a project that is up and running and you got tests going. You mentioned before that you should automate it. I totally agree with that. But what are some options to automate that? Because I'm sure that not everybody here has a dedicated automation team or anything like that. So what can you use to get started there?
So there's a couple options. I mean, I've used the built-in Xcode server and it's worked fine for me in my personal use, just me. So that's certainly an option, at least to get started and play around with it. If you don't have experience with continuous integration, like why not? Xcode server is built into Xcode now. It used to be a separate thing that you have to set up and configure, but
will that run the test like in the background on the same machine?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, that's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and if you have multiple machines, like I think that like I have a laptop and a desktop at home, so I think like my laptop, if I open up that project and run it, it'll run it on my desktop. So that's one way to get started. If just really low barrier to entry. There are other tools out there. I know Fastlane is working on building out some continuous integration tool. There's other tools like Jenkins and Travis, and there's a lot of tools out there that you can use that will build your application or run the tests for you and notify you of the results.
So they'll build your test for you?
So they won't build the test for you. So you still have to write your tests, but what they'll do is you upload your application whenever, when you make a commit, they'll monitor your repository, like your GitHub repository where the code is stored. Whenever there's a new commit, they will automatically build that application for you and run the tests. So instead of you needing to go and manually, press Command U before you submit your code, you can just submit it, and then the continuous integration server that you choose to use will automatically build that and then notify you of the results. So if something fails, you'll get an email or a notification in Slack or whatever it might be that says, hey, you had 99 passing tests and 1 failing test, and you can go investigate that. Let me know if anyone else has more experience with some of those tools, because I have almost zero with some of those other tools.
Yeah, and iOS continuing integration is kind of difficult in a way because like your continuous integration agent has to be a Mac.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can't just do it on, because I know like Travis, you have to have like a specific setup in order to run it because it has to run on a Mac. It can't just be run on any like Linux machine.
Yeah.
That's true.
One thing you can consider is, I know it's in the weeds, but you could write a pre-commit hook on your own machine and then trigger the command line to run the test for you.
Yep, that's certainly an option.
I think that's actually what the Xcode server does behind the scenes.
Is it really? I didn't dive into it.
I remember setting up Xcode server on a separate computer, a Mac Mini, and it would monitor our repo remotely, and it was a Git commit hook.
The benefit of doing a pre-commit hook is that you couldn't actually commit your code if the tests didn't pass.
Okay. I can see that potentially being a problem for large projects. So.
Oh, yeah.
I've worked on projects that take like 20 minutes to compile from scratch.
Oh.
Yeah, so. But yeah, if it's a lot faster, that would be good.
And that's also a consideration too, what continuous integration service you choose to use, whether you choose something that you can run on your own machine like an Xcode server, or if you choose to use some sort of cloud provider. I think Travis would compile that on their server for you and run those. So if you don't want to run all those tests locally, or it takes too long or whatever, you can choose a continuous integration service that best fits your needs.
There are definitely some ways that you can set yourself up so you don't shoot yourself in the foot with like GitHub and GitLab and other like Git providers with merge requests or pull requests. Even if you're doing that just kind of on your own project, you can set up something like Travis to run the continuous integration after you do a commit, so post commit. But then you can set up rules for your like pull requests so that it will not allow you to merge unless it passes all those tests. So there's a lot of infrastructure that you can put behind it to make it solid, but But yeah,
it's a lot of fun and to play with, and also can be very frustrating to get that configuration file just right so that it builds and runs a test. So that's why I guess if you're just starting out and just want to experiment with continuous integration, just fire up Xcode server. I mean, it's not I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's pretty easy compared to some of the other options that are out there, and it at least gets you started with continuous integration.
I think we had a question back here.
Yeah.
So the other thing you could do is use GoCD, and with GoCD, your agents are actually different boxes.
Okay.
So when you register that agent, you could have a different version of Xcode of set. So you can, then you have all the pipelines, and so you can see all the pipelines run through.
Nice.
You can go that route as well.
Yeah.
And GoCD is open source, so you can pull it down. So there's a limit. I think the limitation is like 50 or 500 pipelines. So easy.
If you don't have any more questions, we'll get into this month's coding challenge.
I always have more questions.
Oh,
We're gonna cut you off.
My last question was, I was just gonna ask about UI testing. Did you get into that at all?
I haven't for my app. I've done it before. Personally, I just haven't had a need to get into UI testing. Where I've worked before, we've had a QA team, so anything we couldn't unit test was pretty much covered by the QA team. And personally, I don't know. I haven't found value in UI testing yet to spend the time on maintaining them.
Are the UI testing like end design, or that each element does what it's supposed to when you tap on it?
Kind of both. You could kind of set it up to do either or. So basically, the gist of UI testing is it uses the accessibility features to essentially search the interface for specific UI elements, buttons, labels, whatever, and then uses those accessibility labels to interact with them, whether tap or swipe or whatever it might be. So it kind of is almost like you're programming a human interaction on that view, but it's
almost like the Automator.
Oh, Vaseline?
Yeah.
Yes. If you've ever used the Automator app on the Mac, where you can like record what you're doing and it'll replay it back. Like that's kind of how it works.
Right, and so yeah, to get started with UI tests, it's not hard to start because Xcode is a nice tool that you can run and automatically records your interactions with the screen and essentially writes the test for you. But it's the maintenance down the road, keeping that up to date when if you move a button or change a label or whatever it might be. So.
I will say if you have like a big project that doesn't have any tests, they can be kind of easier to quickly write UI tests that cover a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Like they cover a lot of code, but they're not going to cover a ton of test cases.
Right.
You know, every single input and output, you know.
Right.
And then kind of the downside to them is that they take a long time to run.
Yeah, they do take a long time to run. And I don't know if you've had experience. My experience is they tend to break a lot quicker than a unit test would. So it's like, at least where I've worked before, we have written UI tests, and it's like 2 weeks later when the designer changes, the label or something, that UI test just broke. And so it just has been, in my experience, more effort than it's worth to keep those up to date. Yeah, it worked.
Did something.
Right.
But the thing for me, like that I was hoping it would do, because I'm just a noob at developing, or iOS. Like when I click an X, it doesn't work, but if I tap over here somewhere, it does work. And it's like, oh, somehow I misplaced this button that's invisible and moved it somewhere.
Right.
Like that kind of stuff would be super helpful.
Yeah.
If I could be like, oops, I broke that with this change.
I'm trying to think.
Or a button accidentally goes to 0. It's still there, but you can't click it as a human.
I'm trying to think. Does anyone have experience with like validating like design through UI tests? Like I expect this button to be here, like in this area or whatever.
Yeah, so Facebook has a tool called Snapshot, and basically it runs your app and takes screenshots, and you look at them and you're like, all right, these are, you have your designer sign off on them and say these look correct. and it basically saves those images. And then when you run it again, it'll take new screenshots, and it literally diffs the old image with the new one, and it'll highlight like,
Smart.
hey, this button no longer is in the same
X and
place
Y
as like where you said it should be.
Yeah.
So that might like help with what you're talking
What's
about.
that called?
Snapshot?
I don't think Facebook maintains it anymore.
Oh, they don't.
No, I,
There's similar. I know there's other ones out there, but if you start there, you'll find something.
Another tool you can use for visual is app view tools. And so as you drive your visual tests or drive your app, you can take those same snapshots and it does all the comparison for you. And so it has the nice
What's it called?
app view tools.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks, guys. Coding challenge. Coding challenge. Blake interrupted me.
sorry.
All right. So this month's coding challenge is a little bit more ambiguous than last month's coding challenge. Yes. Okay. So a couple things. So, I moved it. Okay. So the first part of the coding challenge is to write unit tests to validate the ingestion of the JSON that drives the data source. So we have a JSON file in the bundle, and we just bring that in, use a JSON decoder. Shout out to Blake from last month. And we decode that data. Right now, there are no tests for this. We don't know. We don't know if the decoder works. We don't know if pulling in the data works. I'm going to add a few more guides to maybe kind of help you guys through this. But that is the coding challenge for the month. And then there's a secondary spot. I can't remember where it was, though. Oh, so I had mentioned that the way I wrote this test, the test for the sorting of the locations, may not be 100% ideal for a unit test. So if the bonus points are if you can update not only this test, but the sorting method itself to be more testable. If you need a hint, reach out on Slack, and I'll let you know what I think needs to be improved on that method. And I'll be interested if anyone finds a better way to do it. But, yeah. So that's your challenge. I'll post on the GitHub repo and with some guides. So anyway, thank you all for coming out.